I believe that we have all had the pleasure of revisiting video games from our past. Video games that have made an impact on you as a player, or games that you hold fond memories with. Revisiting games is something I've done a few times on this channel before, like in my Z Kevin video and my Pokemon Brick Bronze video. In those videos, I not only got a chance to revisit my past experiences with those games, but also to look at them with a new and much older perspective. So in this video, we are going to be revisiting a game that is both very important to me, but also to this channel's very existence, which that game being none other than Lore Game. For those of you who are unaware of what Lore Game is and its history with this channel, I first played Lore Game all the way back on June 1st of 2021. At the time, Lore Game had a small community of players and not a lot of content in the game. But over the course of 2 years, I have gotten to watch Lore Game develop into a true masterpiece. Going from a small community of players exploring this brand new world, to a collective of dedicated players who make the Lore Game community one of the most chill and awesome communities out there. Now, sure, there are some toxic players, but the goods outnumber the bads, so whatever. To give you a quick rundown of what I'll be covering in this video, I'm going to be trying to cover everything I know about Lore Game, going into how it was developed over the years, how the community has grown and in some cases reverted back to what it was, and my own personal experiences with Lore Game. Because while I like to think I have made an impact on the game, the most I have probably done as a player is make people scared to go near edges. So, with that intro out of the way, I'm Kylo Cooper, and let's write a love letter to Lore Game. What is Lore Game? Well, Lore Game is an adventure RPG, and I use that term very loosely, created by IAKURO as a passion project. The game is centered around you exploring this massive cave, finding new abilities and weapons. Back when I had first discovered this game, it really intrigued me. So much so that I decided that I wanted to make a video about it in a, and I quote, new style. And that style being the same retrospective video essay thing that I still do to this day. And while this game was made by one person, the game did have a pretty rough development journey with data resets, quest changes, and an entire content rework. But for now, let's go to the very beginning of my Lore Game journey and see where it all began. After I had made my Lore Game in a nutshell video, I asked one of my close friends to check out Lore Game and see if he'd be interested in making some videos on the game with me. This friend being SmartMass14. I'll talk more about him later because he is quite a handful.
Oh my God!
Get in the house!
I'm trying to!
Anyway, around the time we began playing Lore Game together, IAKURO would release Lore Game's first ever major content update. This update being the Forge, bringing along 2 new areas for players to explore, along with some new weapons and armor. Now, before we continue, I need to explain a vital rule in Lore Game that has kept up since the game's development. If you were around during the beginning of Rogue Lineage, then you are probably aware of what content locking is, or gatekeeping. Back in the day when Rogue Lineage was relatively new, content creators like myself were not allowed to make tutorials or showcases of content within the game. This meant that you had to discover all the classes, weapons, and all of that other stuff on your own. Now, because the progression in Lore Game is based on discovering new things and doing puzzles, Lore Game has a similar rule to Rogue Lineage, where you aren't allowed to upload content showcasing how to obtain items. Now, this rule was kind of flimsy because unlike Rogue Lineage, Lore Game is a free-to-play game. So anyone could just create an alt account and showcase everything without a care in the world. IAKURO would try multiple things in order to stop players from leaking information, but I'll be getting to that later. For now, let's move on to the second ever lore game video I made.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Let's see it.
Whoa!
Put it on, mate.
Let's see
Put
it, mate.
on. Drip check. Drip check.
Whoa!
Oh my god, you pimping, bruv. I'm about
I'm
to hit you
pimping,
all.
mate. I'm pimping.
Alright, so the hat was my second ever lore game video made, and it was, interesting.
Alright.
Whoa! Whoa!
Whoa!
No!
Jump down to my name.
Leap of faith! No!
You missed. Look at this too. I say it like this.
How fast can you realize you're single, Tommy?
No, I say it like.
Yeah, so the whole point of this video was to obtain the new the hat. At the time, the hat was the fastest helmet in the game, giving the highest speed boost. And my friend SmartMass14 really wanted it. For some reason, SmartMass14 really liked being fast in video games, which is why throughout his entire playthrough, he continued to wear and probably still wears the Fool's armor, which more on that later. Going back to the video, we spent most of the time just goofing around, talking about random ideas we had for the game, and fighting this stupid robot over and over again. Because in order to get the hat, you need to kill this fat robot and bring his arm to a certain NPC. However, the first time we did it,
I'm not gonna lie, it would be. Are you f***ing kidding me? God damn, now we have to go kill it again!
No! No!
yeah, this video was just really funny, and looking back at how much fun I had during the recording, I couldn't help but feel really happy. For you, the viewer, I'd say the only thing to keep in mind for this video specifically is that in this video, this is where we began to speak in a British accent. Yeah, I don't really know why, but yeah, we began referring to fights as we're having a British brawl, yeah? And while that may not make any sense right now, later in this video, it still probably won't, but it might explain a few things. The next video I would make after the hat would be tax fraud. There isn't really a lot to mention in this video, mainly just some funny stuff like in the beginning of the video, which to explain that, something SmartMass14 and I really like to do was improv. Usually we would just be playing a game or messing around in it, and we would end up doing some weird improv thing where we would be role-playing characters or whatever. The entire beginning of this video was us just being socially awkward and then talking about how we haven't paid the taxes for our house. Which, a quick fun fact about the house that this video takes place in, the house was originally supposed to be the spawn location for Lore Game's first ever boss, which was this weird rat king thing, I don't know. Sadly, IAKURO would never end up adding this boss into the game, so it stayed a abandoned house. Anyway, the video ends with us realizing that we are in crippling debt, and that our best option to pay back the IRS ninjas was to get a job. And because SmartMass14 and I were terrible at lore game PvP, we decided to get a little creative.
You're bad. Tommy, stop! Dude, I'm trying to get... Oh my god!
Get in the house!
I'm trying to! There's no security, it takes a minute. Fuck, god damn it! Tommy, go, you gotta get him!
Hobo's doing it!
What's his name? Still trying to get up. She's just coming back. I told you, it's my turn on the tablet! God damn it! Fuck out of here! We're gonna have speedy iron, bitch. People.
I got it. I did it.
Tommy! He's coming to the fishing spot! They're going!
I hit him in.
Who? I'm broken. Yeah, get him off, get him off.
Get him! No, he knows. Yes!
What you just watched was the intro to my favorite lore game video. The video is simply titled Fishing. Now there is a lot to unpack with this video, as there is surprisingly a lot of depth in jumping off of a cliff and hitting players into the void. So first, I'll be going over how fishing works, then I'll be going into detail about the actual experience in the video. So let's get into it. Fishing is a lore game killing technique which takes advantage of two key factors: the art of trickery and the element of surprise. The first rule of fishing is the element of surprise. Lore game is surrounded by darkness. Shadows fill up practically every corner of your screen. Nowadays we have things like the optic mask and spectacles that can let you see further into the dark, but back in the day, we had nothing but a small lantern by our sides. As a fisher, we would take advantage of this by just dropping down from the shadows, killing them instantly. This was what made fishing so funny, because players wouldn't even be able to register the fact that you were in front of them by the time they got ragdolled and hit off the cliff. Almost like a jump scare if you really want to get down to it. The second rule is basically your backup technique in case the fish that you are attacking is aware of you dropping down on them. This requires you to get a little creative and try and feint them, or maybe even teleport behind them to hit their blind spot. The Ancient Ember teleport is something I'll talk about later, but this step is basically only used if you mess up on step 1 and just hitting them off. And odds are you won't really need to be doing this unless you've hit someone off multiple times and they're aware of your presence. Mechanically speaking, fishing took advantage of a lot of old lore games mechanics. Back during the recording of this video, lore game did not have a lot of mobility. In the reworked version of lore game, you have access to a slide which makes parkour much faster. However, back in the day, jumping and dashing had a pretty long cooldown. This meant that you had to take your time on the parkour, as one mistake could send you all the way back to your spawn point. Fishing took advantage of that small time frame. Players would have to wait on a platform for their dash to come back. And while unsuspecting players waited patiently for their dash to go off cooldown, we would have enough time to quickly jump off and fish them. Another mechanic which made fishing much easier was being able to see players' name tags. This made us much more confident when jumping into the darkness because we knew a player was there standing on a platform. Speaking of the platforms, allow me to mention the best fishing spot of all time. Yes, the very same forge that was added in the big update. And because at the time there was a big influx of players who had just found out about lore game, we had more than enough players to kill. There are some other things I can mention, like specific spots where we would drop down, but that would make this segment a little longer than it should be. So let's move on to the actual video. Starting off with the intro at the beginning of the video, this was a Super Smash Bros. Edit of all the people that we had fished in the video. These so-called fish would actually go on to become contributors and moderators for lore game, which I found to be pretty interesting. This video was also where we would adopt our British personas, where we would begin calling ourselves James and Jeremy. The basic idea of fishing in this video was that we were fishers looking for the special fish called the English salmon. And we would drop down and catch the fish that were heading up the stream, which was the parkour. At the beginning of our fishing trip, there were only a few players showing up at first. However, as our fishing spree continued, a few players began to actually try and fight us. One of those players being Sheesh. This guy was an absolute menace during our fishing trip. Now, to be fair, we did hit him off a few times, so it made sense that he was out for revenge. And even while he was attacking us nonstop, he actually did end up helping me get a kill, which was just awesome. Our fight against the fish would continue, with the fish beginning to take the upper hand as they would set their spawn points at the forge. This was when we found an unlikely ally in the form of Hobo. Hobo was just this random dude we continuously hit off until we just felt bad and let him through. And to our surprise, he would end up joining us on our fishing trip and eventually getting the hang of it for himself. Our fishing trip would continue for hours as SmartMass14 and I continued to kill anyone in sight. It had gotten to the point that even IAKURO had joined the game and we began fishing him as well. The only reason our fishing trip actually came to an end was because I was banned from the game. Now, I'm pretty sure it was a bug that banned me, but I still have no idea to this day. This video was just so fun to make. It still stands as one of my favorite videos that I have made just because of how stupid it was. However, little did SmartMass14 and I know that fishing would have a much larger scale effect on the game than we had expected. After we had finished our fishing trip, Lore Game would make a few changes. One of those changes being the planks. For some dumb reason, the people in the community were complaining that, "Oh, the parkour is too hard," and "Ooh, I get hit off too much." So IAKURO added a bunch of wooden barriers and planks that players can walk on because the parkour was quote-unquote too hard. And if adding more room for players to move around on the parkour didn't make fishing hard enough, in the current version of Lore Game, you can barely fish at all. You can't see players' name tags anymore. Players have much more mobility, basically making the forge spot unfishable. And the worst of all, however, there was one addition to Lore Game that has opened up a lot of opportunities for fishing. Back in Fishing 101, I mentioned the Ancient Ember. Originally, the Ancient Ember used to just give your weapon a special ability, but this was reworked to be a simple teleport, which is probably better for balancing reasons. I personally am very fond of the Ancient Ember as a teleport ability because it opens up so many rooms for tricks in PvP. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this broadcast to bring you, drumroll please, Lore Game references! Ooh, with the question mark. Yeah, this segment is basically some theories about certain things within Lore Game that I believe to be related to fishing in some ways, so let's begin with our theories. Before Lore Game was reworked, all the armor in the game was originally created by Blotnik. Eventually, IAKURO would go through the process of recreating all of the armors in a more consistent style, and while many of the armors were redesigned, IAKURO did take some inspiration from the original designs. The reason I bring this up is because one of the few armors to still resemble its predecessor was the Fool's Armor. The same armor worn by SmartMass14 throughout his entire playthrough. And to my surprise, the armor was actually renamed the Fishman's Outfit. Now, if that's not a reference or a coincidence in any way, let's see you non-believers explain this. Fishing is real, my friends. The death arc of Lore Game was the lowest point in Lore Game's history. Earlier, I talked about how content locking and gatekeeping was a big thing in Lore Game at the beginning. and how players would leak content from Lore Game on YouTube. IAKURO would take some precautionary actions by changing up the location of certain NPCs, runes, weapons, and even going as far as to wipe players' data so that they could refine certain weapons and runes once again. This didn't really do anything to stop leakers from leaking content, as they would just refine it and upload it to YouTube once again. So eventually, IAKURO gave up on this and continued to add small bits of content. During this era, SmartMass14 and I would hop on one last time together to see the new casino that was added. This was probably the most empty I had seen Lore Game, as we were the only people in the game at the time. Sadly, however, this was the last time I would play Lore Game with SmartMass14. And when looking back at the video, I remember genuinely thinking that this was the end of Lore Game. So the content rework had dropped and everyone's inventories and data had been wiped. This wasn't that bad if you were a regular player, but for me, it was pretty rough. In the casino video, SmartMass14 and I ended up gambling away $5K each, an amount of money we both did not have. And after gambling a few times and betting on Ben too, we both ended up with some serious debt. You know, it's kind of funny. We've really gone full circle with this lore, going from evading taxes to finding a job, and then ending up in debt. Anyway, Lore Game's rework was a pretty big step for Lore Game. New animations, new armor, new stances. They even added voices for your character, which is pretty cool. The rework was just a bunch of quality of life changes for Lore Game. However, this then brings us to Lore Game's biggest update to this day. Layer 5 was unlike anything we had seen before. This was an entirely brand new area from the one that we are familiar with. Instead of these dull caves and platforms we were used to, Layer 5 is this giant frozen wasteland with strange architecture and crazy looking monsters. Now, comparing the two areas, Layer 4 and Layer 5, is a night and day difference in my opinion. Like, let's just compare the hardest boss in Layer 4 to the hardest boss in Layer 5. Looking at Layer 5, it is just incredible. Just to geek out a little bit here, but the map looks really good. I have personally always been a fan of snow biomes in video games, with one of my favorite areas in Roblox games being Voxel Blade's Icy Plateau. I would say that the only downside of Layer 5 is that it's brought down by Lore Game's biggest flaw, which is its sense of direction. I know I have mentioned Lore Game's lack of a direction a lot, but there is really nothing to do in Layer 5. The only reason people go there nowadays is to just get the items that are only found in Layer 5, in which they head right back to Layer 4 after. What also sucks is that it is a total pain to go back and forth between Layer 4 and Layer 5. If you do not have the escape rune, you are going to be climbing up and down this passage every time you want to go to Layer 5. But going back to the Layer 5 update itself, Layer 5 was Lore Game's last major update, in which it has been a year since it's come out. This is because after this update, IAKURO would begin working on another project called Veloi.xolo. So now that we have finally made it to this point, let's see what the current state of Lore Game looks like. As of now, Lore Game is still dead. Not as dead as it was in the Dead arc, but definitely dead. Nowadays, everyone usually just hangs out in the game's starter town, Bulwark, talking, fighting, usually both at the same time. But what's most important is that the community keeps this game alive. It's kind of like if Lore Game was an old car, and the community are a bunch of mechanics working to keep it in prime condition. The community of Lore Game is something I have mentioned a few times, but just to get it out of the way, Lore Game's community is unusual. On one hand, it's usually just a bunch of weirdos rambling on about random stuff in the game, but on the other hand, it's unlike anything I have ever been a part of. In the intro, I mentioned how Lore Game's community had grown, but also reverted back to what it originally was. What I meant by that specifically was how connected you as a player are to the community. In old Lore Game, I would see these same players time and time again. Now, granted, back in the day I was a total annoyance to players, but it made all of those annoying moments more memorable as I would see those players when I joined back. This aspect of Lore Game was lost for a while after the game got some publicity. This caused not only for my Lore Game in a Nutshell video to skyrocket in views, but also caused most servers in Lore Game to be full of new players. However, in Lore Game's current state, it seems to have somewhat returned. Every once in a while I'll hop onto a server to see some reoccurring faces, which just makes me really happy as a player. The L's of Lore Game are kinda like the 7 deadly sins, except instead of being a religious separation from God, the L's of Lore Game are the different fundamentals that make Lore Game, Lore Game. The L's of Lore Game being looks, larping, losing, lols, and love. So, with that out of the way, let's get right into it. Now, something that has always been a part of Lore Game since the very beginning was drip. In the reworked version, drip has been taken to a whole new level, with all the different armors you can combine and mash together, all while having the ability to also dye each of those armors different colors. Also, I swear to God, IAKURO, if you do not add a pink option for fabric on armor, I will lose my shit. The looks aspect of Lore Game also plays into the player's avatar. When you start off the game, you are actually given a small character customization menu. This is pretty irrelevant as there are multiple NPCs in the game which can change your avatar for you, Also, something I mentioned all the way back in my Lore Game in a Nutshell video was how all the faces in Lore Game looked like they were made by Z Kevin. And after reviewing a bunch of Z Kevin's games and now revisiting Lore Game again, I still stand by this claim. The faces in this game are absolutely hilarious, each having a very exaggerated but also very distinct emotion. Well, that's really all there is to talk about when it comes to looks, but just to keep this segment going a little longer, let's do a Lore Game fashion show, just to show off the amazing outfits players have created in Lore Game. Lore Game Larping is a term I never thought I would find myself saying, but it is surprisingly very real. Dare I say that it's one of the things keeping the game alive. Lore Game guilds are community-run factions which have been around as far back as the Forge update. The guilds kind of function like those classic Roblox military roleplays, with many of the guilds having their own lore, ranks, and uniforms. Personally, I have never been fond of guilds, mainly because I think it's really cringy. But to give credit where it is due, being able to host events and conduct in-game wars is pretty impressive, and is one of the reasons that Lore Game is still alive to this day. Because of Lore Game's no sense of direction, factions are basically given free will to come up with their own lore events and host wars with other factions. The guild that I recorded during this footage was called Eshin? Ishin? Something like that. They are probably the most active guild in the game right now. Honestly, I'm just waiting for another big guild to come up and rival them so that there can be a big war in a server. Now that would be pretty cool. Drifting away from the topic of guilds, to my surprise, I was able to find another form of Lore Game LARPing. Recently, I was doing some digging on some old documents and came across an old newspaper series called the Bulwark Bugle. The Bulwark Bugle is a series of news articles written by Maliko. The series, while pretty dated, does feature some strange information. You have wanted criminal cases, popular guilds at the time. The series even features interviews with IAKURO, Loot, the producer of Lore Game's early OST, as well as being the buffest man in Lore Game, and Steve. Yeah, he's Steve. Another evidence of written Lore Game media was in the form of Ammon's journal. Ammon's journal is written by the cleverly named Ammon the journalist. His journal entries are really well documented, surprisingly. I specifically liked how he described the fissure. The way he writes about the structures and his findings make you feel like you're actually there walking through the fissure alongside him. He also has a great sense of fashion. I will probably leave the links to these documents in the description of this video, but if not, you can probably find them somewhere archived on the Lore Game Discord server. Losing in the L's of Lore Game stands for combat. Why? Because I am terrible at the PvP in Lore Game. Because explaining how the combat works in Lore Game would take way too long, I'm going to be giving you some weapon stereotypes. Sword. You're boring. Axe. You think you're funny. Billhook. You are funny. Banjo. You're chill until someone hits you. Then, you summon the power of the banjo gods and smite them for disrespecting you. Mace. You suck at the game and are probably hated by your family. Dagger. Even more boring than sword. Sparthax. No one uses this. Zweihander. 9 times out of 10, you're the most aggressive, absent-minded player in all of lore game. You know Zweihander is overpowered and abuses its power to no end. The laws of lore game are all of the goofy things players come up with to do in lore game. Because when you're still playing a game that hasn't been updated for a very long time, you tend to get a little creative. I have seen these weird amalgamations of players running around Bulwark created by one of lore game's many glitches. I've seen players climb up to the borders of the map just to try and snipe players with a shield. I have seen a dude just run around Bulwark like a maniac, knocking down groups of people, calling it bowling. I have met a group of players called the Ghosty Hunters who were attempting to hunt down the eldritch being inside of the blind chasm called Mary Ann. And one of lore game's contributors, Loot, has an entire strategy on how to kidnap players. By luring them with a decoy inside of a cell, he then begins distracting the victim into typing in chat. Loot would then open up the cell as the decoy inside would quickly slide out as the player is then hit back into the cell. There is just a lot of stupid stuff you can do in lore game, and while I still believe that the game's lack of a direction is its biggest flaw, it does allow the player base to get really creative, which is something I would like to see lore game build off of more, but I'll talk about that later. And the last L of lore game is love. I cannot begin to explain the amount of passion the community has for lore game. You have players making guilds with their own lore and story, fashion clubs to show off the drip within the game, all of the different documents created by dedicated players. Hell, something I didn't even mention about your character was when you type in chat, each character has its own little voice, and depending on what word you say, that voice can either be high or low. This has created an entire part of the community who are dedicated to making songs that you can sing within the game. Now, I have already talked greatly about lore games community, but seriously, the people in this community are incredible. Over the past few weeks of recording footage, I have met a lot of different types of players. Players who were lore game experts. Players who were still uncovering the many mysteries within lore game. Players who simply joined to just mess around with friends. And players like me, who are here to reinverse themselves in this strange world. Just seeing such an alive community who still find enjoyment in lore game makes me really happy. And it's why I believe that there is still a lot of potential for lore game to resurrect. A common theme I have noticed among other content creators who have reviewed lore game is that they view it as an adventure RPG title. And to be fair, even when I first reviewed the game, I too called it an adventure RPG. But after revisiting lore game with a different perspective, I now begin to consider lore game to be a PvP hangout similar to that of Verdant Moon. So if lore game were to make a comeback, I would love to see updates lean more towards combat and player interaction rather than adventures and boss fights. I mean, the player interaction in lore game is one of the many reasons players still continue to come back to lore game. If lore game were to get a update, why not add a fast travel system? At this point, most of the player base has found everything within the game, and everyone just hangs out at Bulwark. By adding a fast travel system, it would open up many of lore game's underused areas. Take for example the place where you get the nails. The entire questline to get the nails is surrounded around this carpenter, creating a full arena that is never used, because it's too far away. This is also combined with the fact that one of the reasons players still play lore game, and I'll say it again, is for the player interaction. And after you add the fast travel mechanic, you can then work on adding new weapons, skins, armors, and an idea to actually go with that would be to host a community event, where players can submit concepts for armor and weapons, then you would pick out your top choices and let the players decide what to add. I mean, that's one of the ways I ended up even making this video. Now, a fun fact about this video I actually had to change the ending of this video, which is the version you are hearing right now. Originally, the ending was going to be a sad plea for lore game to be updated, because a game as good as this should really not be left to rot. However, as it turns out, the day this video is going to be uploaded, lore game actually got an update. It wasn't a big update, but it's an update nonetheless. And the update seems to be leaning more towards player interaction, which is just great. So instead of ending on a sad note like I had planned on, let's end this video in celebration that we get some more lore game content. And with that, I am Kylo Cooper, and I hope you enjoyed this chaotic mess of a lore game video. Originally, I thought this would be on the shorter side of my videos, but as I kept researching and writing, this video ended up being my longest video to date. So with our love letter written, let's send it to the post office and hope it makes its way. Thank you for watching.